You're standing at the edge of a forest that should not feel dangerous yet. The air is warm and wet, the kind of heavy, greenhouse air that makes every leaf shine like it has just been pulled from a river. Somewhere overhead, insects pulse in the trees. Somewhere farther off, something small scrambles through the undergrowth and goes quiet. In front of you is a patch of muddy water, brown and still, exactly the kind of place where your brain expects the danger to be. Because you know this story? You know what a crocodile is supposed to do. It waits. It sinks beneath the surface until only the eyes remain. It lets the world forget it is there. And then, when something thirsty gets too close, the water explodes. That is the image we inherited, a low body, a hidden body, a living trap with teeth. So naturally, if you were dropped into this ancient forest and told there was a croc nearby, you would watch the water. You would stare at every ripple. You would back away from the bank. Smart. Reasonable. Very survival-oriented. And also, in this case, possibly the exact wrong direction to be looking. Because the first warning does not come from the pond. It comes from behind you. A dry sound. A hard sound. Not a splash. Not the slow drag of a belly through mud. More like a set of blunt points striking the ground in rhythm. Step. 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 Something is moving through the trees, and it is not moving like the crocodiles you know. The branches shift. A shadow passes between the trunks. For a second, all you can make out is the front of the animal, a long skull, a jawline built like a clamp, teeth that do not belong to something gentle. It has that unmistakable crocodilian face, the kind of face that looks less designed than excavated from nightmares. But then the rest of the body follows, and the picture starts to go wrong. It is not sprawled flat against the ground. It is not dragging itself through a swamp. Its body is lifted higher than it should be. Its legs, especially the back ones, look too capable, too committed to land. And at the ends of those limbs are toes capped with structures that seem to belong in a very different animal's story. Hooves. Or at least, something close enough to them that the phrase almost sounds like a dare, a croc that ran on hooves. Which is a deeply unfair thing for the fossil record to throw at us, because it takes one of the most familiar predators on Earth and makes it feel suddenly unfamiliar. Crocodiles are supposed to be ancient in the simple way, right? Survivors from another age. The armored leftovers of a prehistoric world. We call them living fossils so often that it becomes easy to imagine them as evolutionary furniture, always there, always low to the ground, always waiting in the same old water. But fossils have a nasty habit of ruining comfortable stories. They do not care what categories feel tidy to us. A tooth does not care what animal you expected it to belong to. A limb bone does not care whether it fits the poster version of prehistory. And when paleontologists find a crocodilian relative with teeth for slicing meat, limbs suggesting a life spent moving on land, and toes that look weirdly hoof-like, those bones become more than anatomy. They become clues. Clues from a case that has been cold for tens of millions of years. The victim, maybe, is our modern idea of what a crocodile is. The suspect is deep time. And the crime scene is a world where the rules of being a croc were not yet as narrow as they seem today. Because this animal was not just odd in the way extinct animals are often odd, with one strange horn here or one oversized tooth there. Its whole existence points toward a bigger problem. If a creature with a crocodile-like skull could move through forests as an active land predator, then maybe the crocodiles we know are not the template. Maybe they are the survivors of a much larger, stranger family history. Maybe the swamp-dwelling ambush hunter is only the final chapter we happen to meet, after the other chapters were torn out. And that raises a question we cannot answer too quickly. What would the history of crocodiles look like if we stopped judging it by the few forms still alive today? Because once you hear hoof-like steps coming from the forest instead of ripples coming from the water, the animal at the center of this story stops being just a weird croc. It becomes evidence that evolution once tried a version of crocodile that did not wait beneath the surface. It walked out onto land. It hunted under trees. And for a while, in a world very different from ours, it may have made perfect sense. The forest does not give you a clean look at it all at once. That might be the worst part. It moves between the trunks in pieces, the way a nightmare does when your brain has not yet assembled the full shape. First the snout, long and heavy. Then the armored back, flashing through curtains of leaves. Then the legs, which are the part your mind keeps trying to reject. They do not fit the animal you think you are seeing. They lift the body. They push it forward. They make the whole creature seem less like something that slid out of a river and more like something that has been using these trails for a very long time. The ground remembers it too. In the damp soil behind it are prints that do not smear into a belly trail. There is no long groove where a tail has dragged through the mud. No wide, lazy sign of a body built mostly for wading. Instead, the tracks come in a pattern, placed, lifted, placed again. They look purposeful. Almost rude, honestly, for a crocodile relative to leave evidence this inconvenient. And the more you look, the stranger the scene becomes. This is not a shoreline ambush frozen in time. This is a forest path. Ferns crowd the edges. Wet leaves cling to the low branches. Small mammals, early birds, insects, and reptiles move through a world that feels familiar in texture but wrong in its cast of characters. The air is thick enough that every smell hangs around: wet bark, warm mud, crushed plants, the faint sourness of standing water somewhere nearby. But the animal in front of you is not behaving like it belongs only to that water. It seems to own the space between the pools, the dry ground, the root tangles, the shadowed lanes under the trees. And that is where the mystery begins to sharpen. Because a crocodilian face usually tells us one kind of story. It tells us about jaws closing fast from below, about a skull designed to hide under the surface, about eyes and nostrils placed like periscopes. But this body is telling another story at the same time. It is saying movement, distance, land, maybe even pursuit. That does not mean it was sprinting like a racehorse through the Eocene woods. Evolution is strange, but it is not required to be ridiculous in exactly the way we want it to be. Still, the clues point away from the image of a low, water-bound ambush hunter. The limbs are part of that clue. The stance is part of that clue. And those hoof-like toes are the part that makes the whole case feel like somebody filed the bones in the wrong drawer. But the fossil record did not misplace a punchline. It preserved an animal from a time when crocodile relatives were experimenting with possibilities that no living crocodile shows us now. And this is where our modern instincts become a problem. We see the present and mistake it for the rulebook. We look at alligators in Florida canals, crocodiles on riverbanks, caimans sliding through South American wetlands, and we think, yes, that is what this group is. Ancient. Armored. Patient. Aquatic. Basically unchanged, except with worse public relations than dinosaurs. But deep time does not work like a museum display where the surviving species are neatly labeled as the final, correct versions. Deep time is messier than that. It is a graveyard of alternatives. It is full of branches that once looked promising, bodies that once worked, strategies that once made perfect sense, until the world changed or the competition changed or the stage itself was rearranged. So when this hoof-toed predator steps into view, it is not just violating our expectations. It is exposing how small those expectations were. The strangest thing may not be that a crocodile relative once lived this way. The strangest thing may be that we forgot crocodile relatives ever had this many ways to live. Imagine watching it pause at the edge of a clearing. Its head lowers. The jaws part slightly. The body goes still, but not in the sunken, invisible stillness of a modern crocodile in water. This is the stillness of something listening. Something reading the forest. A rustle moves through the plants ahead, and suddenly the animal is no longer a statue. The legs gather under it. The toes press into the ground. The body shifts forward. For 1 second, the familiar skull and the unfamiliar posture become the same creature. And that is the image that should bother us, not because it is impossible, but because it feels like a version of the world that almost survived into ours. If this animal was not an accident, if its body was not just a collection of weird parts, Then what kind of ancient world made this design useful? And what else about crocodiles has the modern world hidden from us? The first real clue is small enough to fit in your hand, which feels unfair for something that can rewrite the way you picture an entire branch of life. It is not a full skeleton standing dramatically in a museum hall. It is not a perfect body frozen mid-stride, jaws open, one hoof-like foot raised as if the animal were caught in the act of proving everybody wrong. Paleontology almost never gives us the movie version first. It gives us fragments. A tooth. A jaw. A limb bone. A piece of a foot. A shape in stone that looks ordinary until someone realizes it should not be there. And in this case, the clues do not whisper the same story modern crocodiles tell. They start arguing with it. Begin with the teeth. A living crocodile has a mouth full of conical teeth, excellent for grabbing, puncturing, holding, and dragging prey into water. They are not steak knives so much as biological traps. But in some of these extinct land-going crocodile relatives, the teeth look more like blades. Compressed from side to side. Sharper along the edges. Better suited for slicing flesh than simply clamping down and waiting for the river to help finish the job. That is the kind of clue that makes a paleontologist lean closer. Because teeth are not just teeth. Teeth are behavior preserved in enamel. They are feeding habits made hard enough to outlast continents shifting around. A tooth can tell you whether an animal crushed shells, stripped leaves, cracked bone, or bit into meat with the confidence of something that did not need to apologize for being terrifying. And these teeth point toward a predator that was not built around the classic crocodile trick of vanishing underwater. But teeth alone can mislead you. They are persuasive, not conclusive. A blade-shaped tooth says meat was on the menu, but it does not tell you where dinner happened. For that, you need the rest of the body, and that is where the case gets stranger. The limbs do not read like the limbs of an animal whose main strategy was staying low and hidden in a river channel. They suggest a body lifted higher, a body that could move with more clearance from the ground. The back legs, especially, seem to carry the story forward. They are not just support structures. They are evidence of a different relationship with land. And when you follow those legs down to the feet, the mystery becomes almost annoyingly specific. The toes end in hoof-like coverings. Not the soft, webbed, mud-friendly image that slips easily into our idea of a crocodile, but something harder, more compact, more suited to contacting the ground beneath a walking or running animal. It is the kind of detail that makes the whole creature feel like a contradiction assembled by committee. Crocodile skull, meat-slicing teeth, long-legged stance, hoof-like toes. Honestly, if you pitched it as a monster design, someone might tell you to tone it down. But the fossil record does not need good taste. It only needs time. And time had plenty of room for experiments. So now the clues are piling up. The skull says crocodilian. The teeth say active carnivore. The limbs say land matters. The toes say this animal was not simply pretending to be aquatic. But a good mystery gets more interesting when the clues do not just identify the suspect, but reveal the size of the conspiracy. Because this animal was not alone in being weird. It belonged to a much broader lost world of crocodiliforms, the larger crocodile-line relatives that, across deep time, did not confine themselves to the handful of lifestyles we see today. Some were small. Some were heavily armored. Some lived in fresh water. Some lived near coasts. Some had pug-like snouts, some had long narrow jaws, and some seemed to have spent much of their lives on land. Which means the hoof-toed predator is not a random glitch in crocodile history. It is one surviving clue from a time when the crocodile family tree looked less like a straight line into the swamp and more like an overgrown thicket of experiments. Picture that family tree in darkness. At the very tip, a few living branches glow: crocodiles, alligators, caimans, gharials. Familiar. Aquatic. Patient. But behind them, stretching backward for tens of millions of years, are broken branches we almost never imagine. Predators that walk differently. Bodies shaped for worlds that no longer exist. Ecological roles that were later taken, erased, or replaced. And this is the part that should make the present feel suspicious. If the only croc relatives still living are the ones that fit our modern stereotype, then our stereotype is not proof of what crocodiles have always been. It is proof of which versions made it through. The bones are not just telling us that one ancient animal had a strange foot. They are telling us that the modern world has filtered the story so heavily that the survivors look like the whole truth. So the evidence has brought us closer, but not all the way. We have teeth that cut, limbs that lifted, toes that struck the ground, and a body plan that points away from the water's edge and into the forest. But clues answer one question by opening another. What kind of world would reward a crocodile relative for becoming this kind of land predator? What was happening in those ancient ecosystems that made such a design not just possible, but useful? The trail of clues eventually leads out of the forest and into a drawer. Not a dramatic place, admittedly. No thunder. No giant skeleton looming in the dark. Just fossil bones resting in museum storage, each one carrying a piece of a body that has been gone for tens of millions of years. But this is where the animal starts to become more dangerous to our assumptions. Because when you take those pieces one by one, they stop looking like random oddities and start behaving like evidence. The first clue is the mouth. Imagine holding one of those teeth between your fingers. It is not just a peg for gripping slippery prey. It is narrow, sharp-edged, shaped in a way that points toward cutting. In a modern crocodile, the teeth are excellent at seizing, puncturing, and holding. They are part of an ambush system. The animal strikes, clamps down, twists, drags, and lets the water become an accomplice. Very efficient. Very unpleasant. Great strategy, if you are not the thing being grabbed. But blade-like teeth tell a slightly different story. They raise the possibility of an animal biting into flesh in a more direct, slicing way, the way a land predator might process prey without needing a riverbank death roll to make the meal work. And that is the first little crack in the familiar picture. A crocodile-like skull does not automatically mean a crocodile-like lifestyle. But teeth are only the opening statement. They can suggest what an animal ate, but not how it moved through the world. So the next clue comes from the body behind the head. Picture a modern crocodile hauling itself out of the water. The belly hangs low. The limbs sprawl to the sides. It can move faster than people expect, and if one ever decides to sprint at you, congratulations, you have made a series of unfortunate choices. But its body is still built around a life where water does a lot of the work. Buoyancy supports it. The surface hides it. The shoreline funnels prey toward it. Now place that image beside the bones of this extinct relative, and something does not line up. The limbs suggest an animal that held itself higher, with legs more suited to carrying weight across land. The back legs especially start to feel less like accessories and more like the main witnesses in the case. They imply a body that was not merely visiting dry ground, but using it. Which raises a question. If the animal was spending serious time on land, what was it doing there? And then there are the feet. The feet are where the case gets almost too strange to ignore. At the ends of the toes were hoof-like structures, hard coverings that make you imagine weight pressing into soil, not webbings slipping through water. That detail does not mean this creature was galloping like a horse through ancient forests, because, again, evolution is weird but not obligated to satisfy our cartoon instincts. However, it does mean its feet were doing something different from the feet of the crocodiles we know. They were part of a body plan that made sense on firmer ground. Imagine a footprint in damp sediment, not a long belly smear, not the lazy drag of an animal sliding between water and mud, but a set of impressions that mark contact, lift, and movement. Each print is a tiny argument against the idea that crocodile relatives were always what they are now. And the argument gets stronger when you zoom out from one bone to the whole animal. Skull, teeth, limbs, feet, each clue points in the same uncomfortable direction. This was a predator with a crocodilian heritage, but not a modern crocodile's script. It was not simply hiding in the margins of a river, waiting for the world to come close enough. Its anatomy suggests a life with more land in it, more movement, more active hunting than the stereotype allows. But here is the trick. None of these clues fully solves the case on its own. A tooth can hint at diet. A limb can hint at posture. A hoof-like toe can hint at the ground beneath it. Put them together, and they form a suspect profile, not a confession. The animal begins to look like a land-going carnivore from a lost branch of the crocodile line. But why would that branch exist at all? Bodies do not evolve in empty space. They are shaped by landscapes, by prey, by competitors, by climate, by all the pressures of a world that rewards some experiments and buries others. So the deeper mystery is not just what the bones say. It is what kind of ancient world made those bones make sense. Because if a crocodile relative could walk out of the water, rise higher on its limbs, slice meat with blade-like teeth, and press hoof-like toes into forest soil, then something about that world was inviting crocodiles to become something we would barely recognize. And that means the next clue is not in the animal alone. It is in the stage it walked across. The stage this animal walked across was not just a background. It was another piece of evidence. And like most evidence in deep time, it does not give itself up politely. You have to reconstruct it from scattered clues, rocks, pollen, bones, teeth, ancient river deposits, and the suspicious absence of things you expected to find. Picture the world after the asteroid impact had already ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. The old Mesozoic order was gone. The Cenozoic was underway. Mammals were expanding into new roles, birds were diversifying, forests were spreading and shifting, and ecosystems were still trying out new arrangements. It was not a finished world. It was more like a crime scene after the furniture had been moved. The outlines of what used to be there were still visible, but the new occupants had not yet settled everything. And into that unsettled world came crocodile-lion animals that were not content to stay inside the narrow job description we give crocodiles today. But here is where the mystery gets more complicated. If you only had the head, you might make one kind of mistake. A crocodilian-looking skull can pull your imagination straight toward water. Long jaws, sharp teeth, armored body, case closed, right? Swamp predator. Riverbank ambusher. The usual. But paleontology has learned, over and over, that skulls can be persuasive liars. Not because the bones are wrong, but because our expectations are. We are very good at taking a familiar shape and forcing it into a familiar life. A long snout becomes a shoreline. Big teeth become a modern crocodile strategy. Armor becomes a slow, aquatic body. And suddenly, before the rest of the skeleton even testifies, the verdict has already been written. But the rest of the skeleton objects. The limbs object. The feet object. The teeth object in a different way than we first expected. And the environment objects too. Because this was a time when crocodile relatives were not a single ecological type. They were a whole lineup of evolutionary suspects, each pointing toward a different possibility. One suspect is the ambush predator model. Maybe this animal was still tied closely to water, using land only as a corridor between ponds and river margins. That is the comfortable explanation. It lets us keep our modern crocodile image mostly intact. However, the feet make that suspect look nervous. Hoof-like toes are not what you would predict for an animal whose main story is mud, swimming, and lurking under the surface. Another suspect is the scavenger model. Maybe it wandered on land and fed from carcasses, using sharp teeth to slice meat without needing high-speed pursuit. That could explain some clues, and honestly, nature loves a scavenger more than most documentaries admit. But the limb proportions and body carriage still suggest an animal more capable on land than a casual clean-up crew. And then there is the active terrestrial predator model, the one that starts to make the whole case feel much bigger. In this version, the animal is not just a crocodile relative that occasionally left the water. It is part of a lost experiment in crocodile evolution, a meat-eater using the forest floor as its hunting ground. Not a mammal in disguise. Not a monster made by mixing animals together. A crocodile-lion predator playing a role that the modern world has mostly assigned to very different creatures. And that is the mini twist hiding inside the evidence. The weirdest thing is not that this animal had hoof-like toes. The weirdest thing is that those toes begin to make sense once you stop assuming water was the center of its life. What looked like an absurd detail becomes a clue to a different rulebook. A hard covering at the end of the toe could help with movement across firmer ground. Longer limbs could lift the body for more efficient travel. Blade-like teeth could help process prey away from water. Each clue gets stronger when it is placed beside the others. But none of them works alone. That is what makes the science feel less like a list of facts and more like an investigation. The answer is not sitting inside one bone. It is hiding in the pattern. And patterns can be tricky, because they depend on what you compare them to. Compare this animal only to living crocodiles, and it looks bizarre, almost wrong. Compare it to the broader lost diversity of crocodile-line animals, and it starts to look like one branch among many, one solution among many, one version of being crocodile-shaped in a world that allowed more possibilities than ours does. That is a major shift in perspective. Scientists are not just asking, "What was this animal?" They are asking, "What have living crocodiles made us forget?" Because the survivors can bias the story. They stand in front of the extinct branches like the last witnesses in a courtroom, and if we are not careful, we let them speak for everyone. But fossils have a way of calling other witnesses to the stand. A tooth from one drawer. A limb bone from another. A foot that should not look the way it does. Together, they suggest that the crocodile family history was not a straight march into the swamp. It was a branching set of experiments, with some lions staying near water, some taking to seas, some becoming strange armored herbivores or omnivores, and some stepping onto land as predators. Which raises a more unsettling question. If this animal's body was a real solution to an ancient world, why is that solution gone? What changed so completely that the version of crocodile that walked the forest floor disappeared, while the silent eyes in the water remained? The clues are starting to behave like they know each other. At first, each one seemed strange on its own, the blade-like teeth, the lifted body, the limbs better suited for land, the hoof-like toes. But now they begin to form a chain. The teeth point to meat. Which raises a question. Was this animal taking prey the way modern crocodiles do, with a sudden strike from water? The limbs push back against that idea. A body carried higher above the ground suggests that land was not just a place between hunts, but part of the hunting world itself. But then that raises another question. If land mattered so much, what kind of land are we talking about? Not an open savanna full of antelope-like prey, because this was long before the ecosystems we picture from nature documentaries. Think instead of a warmer Cenozoic world, dense with forests, broken by rivers, wetlands, floodplains, and patches of firmer ground where animals move through green corridors of shade. The stage was not a modern swamp, but it was not a modern grassland either. It was a messy, humid, in-between world, and that is exactly the kind of place where an in-between predator starts to make sense. So now the environment helps explain the limbs. But the environment creates a new problem. In a forested world, why would a crocodile-line animal need those hard, hoof-like toe tips? And here the feet send us back to movement. Soft mud tells one story. Firm ground tells another. A webbed foot sliding through water is useful if your world is mostly pond edges and river channels. But a harder toe tip pressing into soil suggests repeated contact with land, maybe across leaf litter, packed earth, stream banks, and the drier pathways between wet places. It is not proof of a galloping monster, and we should be careful there, because fossils do not like it when we get too excited. But it is proof that the simple picture is not enough. This was not just a crocodile face attached to a crocodile life. The foot changes the question from, could it leave the water? To, how much of its life happened away from it? And once that question opens, the teeth look different again. A predator spending more time on land cannot rely on the water to do all the work. It needs a different relationship with prey. It needs to catch, bite, hold, cut, and process food in a place where buoyancy is not helping and drowning is not an option. Suddenly, the blade-like teeth are not just a weird dental feature. They become part of the same story the limbs and feet have been telling. Meat on land. Movement on land. A body that was not built around vanishing under the surface. But then comes the next question. why would crocodile relatives be experimenting with this at all? And to answer that, we have to pull the camera back even farther, beyond one animal and into the aftermath of a planetary vacancy. After the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared, the world did not instantly hand every ecological job to mammals in a neat little ceremony. There was no crown placed on a tiny furry head while the crocodile relatives politely returned to the rivers. The early Cenozoic was more chaotic than that. Roles were open. Ecosystems were being rebuilt. Different groups were testing what they could become. Mammals were diversifying, yes, but they were not the only players on the board. Birds, reptiles, and crocodiline animals were all part of the reshuffling. Which means this animal's body was not just a strange personal choice. It was part of a larger evolutionary moment, when the future had not yet hardened into the world we know. And that sends us back to the original mystery with a new angle. Maybe the question is not, why did a crocodile relative become so strange? Maybe the question is, why do living crocodiles make that strangeness feel impossible? Because if you met this animal in its own time, surrounded by forests, competing with other predators, moving through an ecosystem still sorting itself out, it might not have looked like a monster of contradiction. It might have looked like a perfectly reasonable answer to the question its world was asking: who can hunt here? Who can move between these wet and dry spaces? Who can take advantage of prey that does not always come to the water's edge? The teeth answer one part. The limbs answer another. The feet answer another. The climate and landscape pull those answers into a single picture. But one piece is still missing. If this design made sense, if it was not a mistake, if it belonged to a real and successful branch of crocodile history, then why did the line vanish from the living world? Something must have changed. Not just in the animal, but around it. The rules of the forest, the competitors on the ground, the climate above it, the prey moving through it. Somewhere in that shifting world is the missing clue, the one that turns a strange body into a story with an ending. And once we find it, the silent crocodiles we still have today may start to look less like unchanged relics, and more like the winners of a very different game. The missing clue is easy to miss because it is hiding in plain sight. We keep asking why this land-going crocodile relative was so strange, as if strangeness is the thing that needs explaining. But that may be backwards. The truly strange thing may be the crocodiles we have left. Think about that for a second. The animals we know today are so specialized, so committed to the edge of the water, that they make the whole crocodile line look like it has always been a story about rivers, swamps, and ambush. Their bodies are masterpieces of patience. Eyes and nostrils placed high on the skull. Powerful tails for swimming. Limbs that can work on land but do not exactly advertise a life of long-distance forest patrols. A metabolism that can stretch a meal into an event. A hunting strategy that turns stillness into a weapon. They are so good at this one version of life that they trick us into thinking the version is the rule. But fossils keep reminding us that survival is not the same thing as normal. Survival is just what is left after the rest of the experiment has been erased. And this is the big turn in the case. The hoofed-toed predator was not a crocodile breaking the rules. It was living at a time when the rules of crocodile evolution were much wider. The modern swamp hunter may not be the original template at all. It may be the narrow ending of a much bigger story. That changes how every clue looks. The blade-like teeth stop looking like a bizarre exception and start looking like one possible tool in a large evolutionary workshop. The long limbs stop feeling like a mistake and start feeling like an answer to a world where moving across land mattered. The hoof-like toes stop being a punchline and become evidence of a lifestyle that the living world no longer shows us. And the animal itself stops being a freakish one-off. It becomes a witness. A witness for a lost crocodile universe. Because across deep time, crocodile-line animals were not limited to the handful of roles still occupied by alligators, crocodiles, caimans, and gharials. Their extinct relatives tried bodies that would feel almost impossible if all you had ever seen was a modern riverbank predator. Some had short, deep skulls. Some had long, narrow snouts. Some were heavily armored in ways that made them look like walking shields. Some adapted to the sea. Some seem to have been more terrestrial. Some may have eaten plants or a mix of foods. And some, like the animal at the center of this mystery, carried the evidence of a meat-eating life on land. In other words, crocodile history was not a straight line crawling toward the nearest pond. It was a branching, restless set of experiments. The twist is that most of those experiments failed to reach us. Not necessarily because they were bad designs. That is the trap. We like to imagine extinction as a kind of judgment, as if the fossil record is grading organisms and only the best students get to stay. But evolution is not a trophy ceremony. It is a negotiation with whatever the world happens to be doing next. A body can be brilliant in one ecosystem and useless in another. A strategy can dominate one landscape and become a liability when the climate shifts, forests change, prey move differently, or new competitors arrive. The same features that made a land predator successful could become less useful if the stage that supported it began to disappear. So when we ask why this branch did not survive, the answer is probably not one simple villain. It is not just mammals. It is not just climate. It is not just habitat. Those are suspects, yes, but the real culprit may be the way all of them interacted over time. Mammals were diversifying into larger and more specialized carnivorous roles. Environments were changing. Food webs were being rearranged. The ancient forests and corridors that made certain crocodile experiments possible did not stay the same forever. And as the Cenozoic continued, the versions of crocodile-line predators that lived more like land hunters may have found themselves squeezed by a world increasingly crowded with other animals better suited to those jobs. But notice what that means. The modern crocodile strategy did not survive because it was the most dramatic. It survived because it remained brutally effective in the places where it still worked. Water edges are powerful habitats. Ambush is a powerful strategy. Patience is cheaper than pursuit. And a body that can hide, strike, fast, and wait has a certain grim elegance to it. So the survivors were not the only true crocodiles. They were the crocodiles whose particular answers kept matching the questions the world continued to ask. That is the reversal. The hoofed predator is not the odd little footnote to crocodile history. It is a clue that the history itself was far stranger than the footnote we call the present. The animals alive today are not a window into everything crocodiles were. They are a filter. They show us the winning remnants, while the fossil record shows us the missing possibilities. And once you see that, the animal in the forest becomes more than a contradiction. It becomes a warning about how easily the present lies to us. It tells us that what feels normal now may only feel normal because all the alternatives are dead. So if this land-going predator was one of those alternatives, then the question is no longer whether it was strange enough to explain. The question is why our world became the kind of place where this version vanished, and the quiet eyes at the waterline remained. By now, the case has too many witnesses to ignore. The teeth, the limbs, the feet, the lost branches of the family tree, the changing world around them, all of them are pointing in the same direction. But they are not pointing to a single dramatic moment, the way a murder mystery points to one person in the room holding the knife. Deep time is rarely that tidy. It is more like following footprints through a forest while the forest itself is moving. The ground rises. The rivers shift. The climate tilts. The animals around you change shape, change size, change strategies. And slowly, a body that once made sense begins to belong to yesterday's version of the planet. Imagine the land-going predator again, standing beneath an Eocene canopy. For now, its world still has room for it. Warm forests stretch across large parts of the planet. Wetlands, floodplains, wooded corridors, and patches of firmer ground create a landscape full of edges. And edges are opportunities. Between water and land. Between forest and clearing. Between old ecosystems and new ones. A crocodile-line predator that could move through that mixed world was not absurd. It was taking advantage of a planet still rearranging itself after one of the biggest ecological turnovers in Earth history. But the Cenozoic did not stay in that first strange draft forever. Over millions of years, climates shifted. Forests expanded in some places and retreated in others. Seasonal patterns changed. Open habitats became more important in many regions. Mammals kept diversifying, and some of them became larger, faster, more specialized carnivores. Prey animals changed too, because prey are not just background extras politely waiting to be eaten. They evolve. They move differently. They get bigger, quicker, more social, more difficult. And every one of those changes is another pressure on a predator's body. A jaw that worked in one food web may not work as well in the next. A foot that made sense on one kind of ground may become less useful when the routes through a habitat change. A hunting strategy that once fit the landscape can start to feel like an old key in a new lock. Which raises the uncomfortable possibility that this crocodile relative did not vanish because it was badly built. It may have vanished because it was built for a world that did not last. That is the direction the clues begin to converge. The anatomy says land mattered. The teeth say meat mattered. The feet say firm ground mattered. The broader fossil record says crocodile-line animals once occupied a much wider range of lifestyles than their living descendants do. And the changing Cenozoic world says those lifestyles were being tested against moving targets, climate, habitat, competition, prey, and time itself. None of these suspects has to work alone. In fact, they probably did not. Climate could reshape forests. Forest change could alter prey routes. New mammalian predators could increase competition. Competition could make certain hunting strategies less profitable. Smaller shifts could build into a long squeeze, the kind that does not look like a catastrophe while it is happening, but leaves a very clear absence afterward. The hoof-like steps fade from the forest. The blade-toothed jaws disappear from the living world. The branch goes dark. And meanwhile, another crocodile strategy keeps working. Not everywhere. Not in every form. But enough. The waterline remains a powerful place to be a predator. A riverbank concentrates thirsty animals. A swamp gives cover. A submerged body saves energy. A sudden strike can replace a long chase. In a world where running predators had to keep up with changing prey and increasingly capable competitors, the patient ambush hunter had its own brutal advantage. It did not have to win the open race if it could control the crossing point. That may be why the living crocodilians feel so ancient to us. Their strategy is old, yes, but more importantly, it is persistent. It kept finding places where it worked. And that persistence has fooled us. We see the survivors and imagine stability. But the fossil record shows the missing turbulence around them. It shows that crocodile history was full of versions that rose, worked, and vanished when the rules changed. So the near answer is not simply that one strange predator died out. The near answer is that Earth narrowed the possibilities. A planet that once allowed crocodile-line animals to explore land predator roles eventually became a planet where that particular experiment no longer had the same opening. Not because evolution was marching toward mammals. Not because crocodiles were destined for the swamp. But because survival depends on fit, and fit depends on the world around you. Change the world, and the same body tells a different story. That is the escalation hidden inside this animal's bones. The case is not just about a foot, or a jaw, or a weird branch of crocodile evolution. It is about how Earth edits life. It does not erase every failed experiment in one clean stroke. It changes the conditions, slowly or violently, until some answers stop answering the question. And by the time we enter the story, millions of years later, we find only the remnants, eyes above the water, armor in the sun, a body so good at waiting that it makes waiting look eternal. But somewhere behind that stillness is the sound that does not survive anymore, hard toes striking forest soil, a predator moving through a world that once made room for it, just before the room began to close. And that is where the case finally turns back toward the animals still with us. Look at a crocodile today, really look at one, and it can seem like a creature that escaped time. The armor. The low body. The stillness. The eyes floating at the surface like two polished stones. It feels ancient in the easiest possible way, as if it simply refused to change while the rest of life ran around reinventing itself. But that is the illusion the survivors create. They make the ending look like the whole story. The bones of the land-going predator break that illusion. They tell us that crocodile history was not a straight line leading calmly into the swamp. It was a crowded, branching experiment, full of bodies that tested different ways of being a predator, different ways of moving through the world, different answers to the same basic question: how do you survive on a changing planet? Some answers had long jaws and patient eyes. Some had blade-like teeth and limbs built for land. Some pressed their toes into forest soil instead of disappearing under muddy water. And for a while, those answers were not wrong. That may be the most important part. This animal was not a mistake that evolution quickly corrected. It was a solution to a world that existed for a time, and then moved on. The teeth make sense when meat had to be handled on land. The legs make sense when moving through forests mattered. The hoof-like toes make sense when the ground beneath the animal was part of its life, not just a bank to crawl over on the way back into the water. The mystery is not solved by saying, ancient crocodile relatives were weird. That is too small. The better answer is that the world they lived in was different enough to make their weirdness reasonable. And when that world changed, the reason changed with it. Climate shifted. Habitats rearranged themselves. Mammals diversified into roles that would come to dominate many land ecosystems. Prey changed. Competitors changed. The questions Earth was asking of predators changed. And some crocodile-line answers stopped fitting. But others did not. The ambush strategy at the water's edge remained powerful, not because it was the purest or oldest version of crocodile life, but because it kept working. A submerged body is hard to see. Waiting costs less than chasing. A riverbank brings prey to you. In that narrow, dangerous borderland between land and water, crocodilians found a way to make patience lethal. So the animals we see today are not unchanged relics in the simple sense. They are survivors of a much larger sorting process. They are what remained after Earth edited away many of the alternatives. And that changes what a living crocodile means. It is not a window into a frozen past. It is a clue to a filtered past. Its body is not proof that crocodile evolution stood still. It is proof that one version kept finding a place to stand, or more accurately, to sink just below the surface. That is the mind-bending thing fossils do. They do not just add strange animals to a list of extinct creatures. They change the meaning of the animals that are still here. A crocodile in a Florida canal, an alligator sunning on a bank, a caiman slipping through dark water in South America. They all look different once you know they are surrounded by ghosts. Not supernatural ghosts, but evolutionary ones. Lost relatives with bodies that no living animal now represents. Land hunters. Sea forms. Armored oddities. Branches that once seemed viable, then vanished so completely that the survivors inherited the entire reputation of the family. And this does not only happen with crocodiles. It is happening all around us. The present is full of survivors pretending to be definitions. Birds make flight look inevitable, until fossils reveal experiments with wings that went nowhere. Mammals make our own bodies feel normal, until ancient relatives show how many other versions of mammal-like life were tried and lost. Even our own features can seem obvious only because the alternatives are gone. Evolution does not preserve every possibility so that the future can admire them. It leaves fragments. A tooth. A limb. A footprint. A strange toe bone that should not fit the story we thought we knew. Science is the work of taking those fragments seriously enough to let them disturb us. So yes, the big question has an answer. Crocodiles are not just the swamp-dwelling ambush predators we know today. That is the surviving version, not the full definition. Their history once included forms that moved through land ecosystems in ways that feel almost impossible from our modern viewpoint. But that answer opens a larger question, one that reaches beyond any single animal. If the living world is only the edited version of life's history, how many things around us look normal, only because the stranger alternatives disappeared? The next time you see a crocodile lying still at the water's edge, the stillness should feel different. It is not just an ancient predator waiting for prey. It is the last visible sentence of a much longer paragraph, one that once included hard toes striking forest ground, a crocodile lion hunter moving through the trees, and a version of life that was real, successful, and then erased so completely that today it sounds almost impossible.